James Perloff is an internationally renowned man of letters known for his gripping and very readable books such as The Shadows of Power, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, and Tornado in a Junkyard. So it is my very great pleasure to have him stop by and chat with me today. Thanks for coming on, James.
Well, thank you, Daniel. It's the first time I've been on your podcast. We've had some nice conversations on the phone, though.
Yeah, no, I mean you're a legend, especially in the circles in which I move. Very just for the audience, read anything that James does. Go to his Twitter. The guy is phenomenal. He's also a memester, brilliant memes that he puts out there. Big fan. What I wanted to start with, James, was you sent me a presentation of yours that was about natural selection or the theory of evolution or whatever they're calling it now. And you did a very good kind of takedown on it. And I was wondering what led you to that. You touch on it in the presentation, but just for my audience, like what led you to start questioning evolution?
Well, I grew up in a non-religious home. We didn't go to church or anything, and grew up, became an atheist, hippie, 1970, and actually became a Christian in 1983. But still these held over ideas because the family used to get National Geographic. And when I was a kid, and they'd have these pictures of Dr. Louis Leakey in Africa, and he'd be looking at these eight men, supposed eight men bones, saying there's the Australopithecines, and so I had this idea. Well, if science says we evolved, what's the story? I'd like to have an answer on this because it's quite contradictory to the Bible. So I started looking into creation materials, and I read a book called "What Is Creation Science" by Dr. Henry Parker, and the book just flattened Darwin's theory, and I was amazed. I said, "Wow, there's actually strong scientific evidence against it." And I read a number of books, but I found that as they're written by PhD scientists from different fields, I found that they were. I was getting through them, but they really weren't good reading, most of them, for the average layman. And I felt I want to write something that would be very reader friendly. And so I set out, and spent about 2 years on this book before they went to publication, Tornado in a Junkyard. And I have a copy over here. It came out in 1999, but I worked on it for 2 years. I spent a lot, I'm in Eastern Mass, so we have a lot of academic libraries here, which I went to Harvard, Brandeis, Tufts, BU, BC, etc. And the book has about 700 endnotes. And I want to make sure I got all the material correct. And the book was reviewed by several PhDs for accuracy before it actually went to print. But that's something I felt that we really needed, because Darwin's theory made a lot of people into atheists. And I acknowledge that there are people who say, well, I believe in evolution and the Bible, but they're really very contradictory accounts, between the Garden of Eden and Darwin's theory that we evolved over millions of years from fish. It's not exactly the same thing. So I became an atheist when I was taught, or started to become an atheist when I was taught evolution in the 6th grade. And I give quite a few examples in that little video, which you can find. I think it's on Rumble, but I think the easiest way to find it is just go to my website, jamesperloff.net, scroll down, and under news, you'll see creation evolution for PowerPoint. Now, I've given a lot of PowerPoint talks over the years, over the last 20 years or so, on this subject. But I looked at it, I said, you know what, a lot of my slides, I give a quote, but I don't have the source for it. And I'd like to just make this presentation a little bit better and make it something that's really suited for the internet. So I give a little introduction in this video. It's 38 minutes long. And then we go through the major arguments against evolution. And then I actually, the very first things I give examples of people like Stalin and Andrew Carnegie and other people who became atheists as a result, just to show people the significance. And then I started tackling the evidence against evolution, all based on the work of PhD scientists. And finally, we tackle some of the common arguments you hear evolutionists use and what the fallacies are in them. And I do have a small book besides Tornado in a Junkyard, which is called The Case Against Darwin. The reason I wrote that one is somebody once asked me for 40 copies of Tornado in a Junkyard, which is over 300 pages in pretty fine print.
Mhm.
And I realized, that's one to give the school board members. And I said, they're just going to toss a 300-page book in the trash can. So I wrote an 83-page book, which covers the basic points. And these books have been on sale for a long time. You can still get them on Amazon. The Case Against Darwin, Tornado in the Junkyard. But the video, I think, is the most refined and up-to-date presentation. When I give PowerPoints, I look at the audience, and if someone's putting them to sleep, I say, well, I'm just going to cut that out, And so this is the best information, the most hard-hitting information with any fat cut out,
Distilled.
just to give people a really strong notion and hopefully revive the faith. Because, I've talked to people in many churches who say when their kids went to public school, it turned them into atheists too. And they were brought up in the faith and they lost it. So this is really pretty important for people to know. And it's also had a big impact on our culture because what many people come up with is the idea that evolution proved that God didn't exist. Life came about without God. And so the Bible is just an old myth. And if the Bible is an old myth, the 10 Commandments are an old myth. And the culture really starts to go downhill once you take away the Christian values. So it's important, even for non-believers who are starting to get uncomfortable with the culture we see ourselves in now.
Yeah, Richard Dawkins even said that. He came around, as the champion of the new atheists. And just recently, I think it was at the end of last year, he said that he does see a need. He sees the logic of religion. And as a social binding agent, it made the news, so even I was just doing the audiobook for Vilfredo Pareto, and he said the same thing, that even if you don't think personally, I don't personally think this is true, that doesn't necessarily mean I think it's bad. And he was talking about things that are good on the individual level, but bad on the social level, on the civilizational level. And so, there are logical arguments, even from atheists, for why, a culture that is bound together by something more than just materialism, why that's necessary for ethical purposes. One of I just mentioned doing an audiobook, by the way, for Vilfredo Pareto, but another audiobook that I did was Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell. And I did that because it didn't exist anywhere. I was reading The Origin of Species with my son, and we would go on little walks and we would read Darwin. We read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations and Aristotle. And so I wanted him to read Darwin, and just to kind of see what the arguments were. And he mentions Charles Lyell over and over and over again. It was his mentor. And Charles Lyell was, finding fossils because he was a geologist in the generation before Darwin. And in your presentation, you talk about like when Charles Lyell expresses skepticism regarding the deluge theory, and he believed in incrementalism rather than catastrophism. And but one of the things that you left out, and just for reasons of brevity, is that the last third of the book, it's about a 1,200-page book, the last third of it, he actually debunks evolution, which at the time was called progressive development, or Lamarck called it, I think, transmutation. And he totally debunks evolution, and he came into bad odor with Darwin in that circle, in the later part of his life, because he does a very good, like, he talks about as somebody who like, for instance, he like the theory that, an animal doesn't have a particular feature or characteristic, it will evolve one over slow periods of time. And he was like, no, that wouldn't happen because it wouldn't be static. He said that when you look at, like, if one animal isn't doing well in a particular environment, another animal will quickly supplant it. So it would not have the long periods of time to develop in that particular, And so he did a very effective job, where he was also pointing out that sharks and all these other creatures that had not evolved that you can see in the fossil record. And so one half of his legacy, is, you're right, was he was kind of normalizing skepticism of the flood concept. But then on the other side, it's kind of a mixed legacy, because he did a very, I thought for the time period, a very effective job of kind of poking holes in what Darwin would later kind of, make famous with Alfred Russel Wallace. So
actually, the quote that I gave in the presentation, which I thought was quite relevant, is referring to Lyell, and it's from 1873. Darwin said this: Lyell is most firmly convinced that he's shaken the faith in the deluge far more efficiently by never having said a word against the Bible than if he'd acted otherwise. I have read lately Morley's Life of Voltaire,
Mhm.
It says strongly that direct attacks on Christianity, even when written with the wonderful force and vigor of Voltaire, produce little permanent effect. Real good seems only to follow the slow and silent side attacks. Now, I found this fascinating because Darwin himself here was acknowledging that he was making a slow and silent side attack in the Bible. Now, I knew in
Yeah.
Victorian England, you couldn't just come out and they'd say the Bible's wrong. That would get a lot of people down on you. But people were trusting science, the developing electricity and the telephone,
Mhm.
the telegraph, and so forth in that century. And the people had a lot of respect for science. So Darwin had the idea, well, I'm just going to introduce this new idea that we evolved from this little pond and the right chemicals came together and that's how life started. And I won't actually say anything against the Bible. I'll just say this is science, and then let people come to their own conclusion and develop their own doubts about the Bible. And it was quite successful. I actually think this is part of the long-term New World Order plan. Darwin seemed to receive some financing to help him out. He didn't make that much money off of his evolution books, but he lived on a big estate with 8 servants. And there was Sir Arthur Keith wrote a biography of Darwin, and he looked at his financial records, and he found during the latter part of his life, he made 34 investments on the London Stock Exchange, and every one of them made money.
Oh, okay.
Even Warren Buffett occasionally makes a bad investment. So if this guy's
But not 34,
not 34 to 34, and if he obviously has some helping hands to guide him, because here's a guy that's studying bird shells, not finance, and yet he always picks a winner in the stock market.
Interesting. Like Karl Marx has a shadowy background, kind of like that too. Where,
so I think he really had helping hands.
Man.
There's definitely evidence for that. But what happened was, as I was saying, Darwin said you couldn't directly attack the Bible, but after his theory became the paradigm, they did directly attack the Bible. It was around the 1890s here in America. They started what they called the higher criticism, where they would say that the Bible, we don't really know who wrote it. And we don't really, believe in the miracles. And we're not even really sure that Christ really existed. This is like being funded by the Rockefellers, the modernist movement, as they called it.
Just really quick, let me jump in here real quick, because I remember it was a German scholar in the 1700s, late 1700s. And so it's funny that you mentioned New World Order, because that's where Christian Weishaupt, right? Like the German university system is what created like Skull and Bones, those secret society type things that morphed into kind of intelligence agencies. So that is interesting. I never thought of that maybe that was the seed bed for, going from Germany to England, from England to the United States. And, Jesus never existed.
So I think it's progressive, and once they destroyed faith in God, then it became very easy to get people to, forget we have a lot of newscasters in mainstream who lie today. Well, they don't respect the 10 Commandments, that you're not supposed to bear false witness, right? Because they think that they've been taught that God doesn't exist, or they think that God doesn't exist based on Darwinian teachings. At least that's a major contributing factor to their way of thinking. So I do believe this is a long-term plan that they've had all along. And we see it now coming to real fruition today with consolidated media control, consolidated control of politicians. And actually, if people go, again, to my website, jamesperloff.net, and scroll down, I also did a recent PowerPoint talk for the John Birch Society up here in New England. And it's pretty long. It's over 2 hours. But I'd written The Shadows of Power, which was 1988, kind of summarize how things had gone up until then. But I wanted to get something that would go right up through 9/11, climate change. So it's a long talk with a break in the middle, but it's loaded with short video clips and imagery. And we kind of go from the Federal Reserve right through today, and showed that it's been very progressive. The World Health Organization is talking about a treaty to override constitutions. And we have climate change lockdowns now. And I've got a clip from the World Economic Forum where they say that China cannot be number one, EU cannot be number one, America cannot be number one. Climate is number one. All the nations must surrender their sovereignty to the climate threat. I say, hey, this goes back to the League of Nations in 1919. This is a progressive plan to bring about a new world order and a world government. And the technologies change and the strategy of the J changes, the new normal comes along. But it has been very progressive, and you really can see the over the years, going back to Darwin and before.
Well, I mean, you make a really good point right there, right? Like how they're using earth sciences to do a wider kind of political ideology, right? And in
Right.
our day and age, it would be climate change, but in Charles Lyell's day and age, it was geology, and then that led into, you know, kind of like paleontology and stuff, and how they'll use it because it has the veneer and prestige of science, and they'll kind of peg a political move. So that's a very great observation. I wanted to ask you something really quickly, because this is my personal theory. I was walking, and just speaking of technology and technological changes and the effect it has. But if you wanted to make a counter argument, right? Like, say, for instance, I wanted to attack the deluge theory, right? Say I'm playing devil's advocate here. And I was explaining to my son how writing happened, the technology of writing. And it usually happened when you see the great civilizations, they're hydraulic civilizations. They're civilizations that are on rivers or oceans or whatever. So the Yellow River in China, the Nile River in Egypt, the Tigris Euphrates in Samaria. And so I was explaining to my son that these rivers had fertile soil, right? You'd get silt come up from the river. So all of a sudden you'd have all these crop yields. So that creates surpluses. The surpluses create trade. And now that you have this trading civilization, they have to keep records. And so writing evolves. And so civilizations that did not evolve around rivers and did not trade, did not develop writing, like sub-Saharan tribes or Brazilian, you know, the Piranha in Brazil, like they never developed writing because they weren't trading. So my point in this is, if you have flood legends and you're like, oh, well, this civilization wrote about it and this civilization wrote about it. Yeah, because we have the records of the civilizations that had writing because they were hydraulic civilizations. So if there was floods in those civilizations and people died, they would record it. So all we're drawing from, our selection mechanism is just the civilizations that were on rivers, that were by bodies of water that may have been subject to flooding, as we know. So that might be like a counter argument if you wanted to play devil's advocate and say, no, you know, the flood legend did not happen, even though we have records all around the world, but we only have records from the cultures that could write, you know.
Yeah, that makes sense. Unless it was somehow passed down just by word of mouth, but it's true. Actually, there are more than 200 cultures that have had a flood legend. You know, the Aleutian Islands, American Indians, Plato spoke of it, of the Great Flood. So all over the world, there's been discussion of the flood, and this is something that affected the whole world. So it's not surprising that Israel did not. I mean, you know, the American Indians would have known about the history of Israel, so they don't have that, but they do have the flood that
Well, you just
that affected
debunked
the
me.
whole world. Yeah.
Because I remember Sequoyah, the Native American Indian chief, they had no concept of writing. And when the English colonel or something introduced him to the concept, he thought it was magic because they didn't have writing, and yet they had flood legends. So that just debunked my proposition to you. So another thing I wanted to ask you about as well, or I noticed, like you mentioned Linnaeus's taxonomy, right? And in your presentation. And so the Swedish, you know, physiologist, he's the first one to create, and the original taxonomy that he created of species and genera and kingdoms, all that kind of stuff, was based on morphology, was based on the shapes of animals. And they've since abandoned that. Now it's DNA. They go by DNA because you can go by the shapes of animals and be totally wrong. And this was one of the things that Darwin said, that he had this mentor who was a botanist. And I think his name was John Henslow. And it was Henslow who told him, okay, when you're doing your plants, arrange them in a particular order. And so Darwin would get, like, you know, one, he used that, it was in his subconscious. So he would take one animal and he would put it here, and then he would arbitrarily kind of put the other animal here, and then imply that they were one evolved from the other. But now we know, because of DNA, that no, these animals, it's kind of like if you're trying to explain a bat existing, and you have like a bird, and then you have a mouse, and then you put the bat skeleton, you know, and then you could do DNA and say, oh no, they're not related at all. But that's basically what Darwin was doing. He was using morphology, and we've abandoned that. So they've quietly made a concession that a lot of the underpinnings of like what he was doing was just wrong, you know, but nobody kind of openly talks about that.
Right. Yeah, of course, they still use morphology when it comes to fossils, and try to arrange a sequence, because they don't have the DNA for that, for those extinct animals.
Yeah, well, that is true, but still, I mean, like when you look at the thing now, I mean, there've been quite, like, for instance, now they'll say things like, oh, well, evolution is based on random genetic mutations. Well, Darwin never heard of random genetic mutations. That wasn't a part of his thing at all. Even though Mendel, the Austrian priest who came up with the idea of genes and kind of inheritance, was contemporary with Darwin, but
Right.
Darwin had never seen his work. What are your thoughts on that? On the kind of backpedaling that they've had, kind of like climate change, right? It used to be called global warming. And
Right.
then if there's 15 years of no warming, they're like, we've got to rebrand. And that's their concession, kind of like gender, what they call, in our generation, they used to call it transsexual. Now they call it transgender. And they'll make that distinction without a difference that, well, gender and sex are different, which I disagree with totally, completely. But nevertheless, that's their assertion. But when they changed it from transsexual to transgender, it was their admission that you can't change yourself, that this is a cosmetic procedure. You are not actually, so I don't know. I always find this interesting.
Yeah. Well, science is supposed to be pretty stable, and yet we see that Bill Nye, the science guy, about 20 years ago, he talked about girls and boys, and he says it depends on your X and Y chromosomes. And then 20 years later, he's saying it depends on your choice. So he's changing the science, and that's what they're doing. But going back to an earlier point you made, they just like Darwin used science to persuade the public. They use science, so-called, and they said this is the subtle science. These vaccines are safe and effective. You have to take them. And it's the name of the climate change. They say that the climate change scientists say we're going to have global warming. And so we have to get rid of cars and stop eating meat and eat insects and stuff like this. And yet back in the 70s, into the 80s, they're talking about the coming ice age. And in that presentation, I have on the New World Order that I mentioned, I have a clip of Leonard Nimoy, 1978, doing hosting In Search Of, an episode called The Coming Ice Age, and covers of Time magazine where they talk about the big chill, watch out. But, it seems that temperatures actually go cyclically for about 30 years up and 30 years down. Not significantly, but enough to feel a little impact. So when after the ice age of the 70s, 80s, the temperatures started to warm up as they usually do. And Al Gore came along and said, well, this isn't the natural cycle. It's people using too much energy and giving off a carbon footprint, and we have to control people, and that's what this is all about. 9/11 and the Patriot Act were about control. Global warming and reducing your carbon footprint is about control. And COVID, the lockdowns were about control. They're all about totalitarian control. Take away your freedoms.
Link this together, your New World Order conversation, because you're an expert kind of in that stuff in the political realm, and then your evolution stuff and how they use kind of fake scientism to manipulate people through politics. But I'm going to bring it together with the Unabomber. The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, who wrote a very brilliant manifesto. To anybody who's read it, it sounds just like Alvin Toffler, who wrote The Third Wave. If anybody reads The Third Wave and reads, from 1980 and then reads the Unabombers, they're almost identical. But I mean, the thinking behind them and everything. But Kaczynski was asked, like, just for everybody who doesn't know, Kaczynski was anti-technological, and he sees the society technology kind of leading us off a cliff, and he wanted to backpedal and wanted to kind of go back to like a 19th century level of civilization, and which I kind of do agree with. I mean, lots of futurists agree with what he's saying, but one of the things he gave a cryptic answer to somebody. They asked him about, like what his thoughts were on something, and he said his favorite book was The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad. And so I read The Secret Agent from 1899, I think it was. And so it's a really, really interesting document because it kind of pulls it all. And I think he was giving a coded message, because The Secret Agent is about a guy named Verloc, right? So there's this agent in England, and he's sent in by kind of like a shadowy kind of foreign intelligence agency or something. It's never specified, but this guy with a foreign accent is his handler. He sends him into England. He's supposed to radicalize groups in England and cause terrorist acts so that they could justify repressive legislation. Sound familiar? And so
Hmm.
one of the things he talks about is the target. He says we have to target something that is associated with science because now that's the popular prejudice. That's their religion. They associate science with prosperity. So he said, so if you attack like a museum, no one will care. If you attack, like a church, no one will care. He said, if, however, you attack something with science and something related somehow to the economy and money and prosperity. And I remembered 9/11. This gets to 9, so he was
Hmm.
talking about false flag terrorism in 1899.
Hmm.
Very, very interesting book. And, so it kind of comes full circle, like New World Order, fake, synthetic terrorism, kind of 9/11 type events, Ted
Hmm.
Kaczynski, like all of this comes together, and then using, like that veneer of science. And I think, and I'm gonna jump out on a limb here. I think that the cart may be backwards. I think what actually happened is the church fell. And when the church fell, the Protestant Reformation happens, 1550s, we lose religion. Everything is in turmoil, and then science comes up, and then people kind of latch onto that as the new religion. Now that we're no longer
Hmm.
run by the church, we're run by nation states, and this becomes the new religion. And so people just, it's very useful.
That's true. You don't see any of our Western leaders using theological arguments for what they're doing with climate change, COVID, Patriot Act, et cetera. It's all based upon science or, as you said, prearranged terrorism. So, yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I mean that's a very powerful, like our founding fathers would use religious imagery. You'd
Mhm.
put your hand on a Bible. Now it's they're using, what was that thing? It was the Milgram experiment, where they noticed that, social science experiment where if they put a guy in a lab coat, a white, an actor, he wasn't even a doctor, but just put him in a lab coat with a clipboard and everybody would just kowtow to him. And it was just disturbing, and people would be torturing other people because the scientists told them to. And so they studied that those studies were well funded, and they were now being deployed because they understand how humans like. I remember the show Impractical Jokers, and it's just like a bunch of guys doing gags in a mall or whatever. And one of the guys had a lab coat and a clipboard, and he was asking people, "Hey, give me your social security number," and people would actually do it. He was like,
Hmm.
I have this perceived authority with all that used to be the priest, like the deference and the respect that you used to give to the village priest is now being given to, the fake scientist. And they know that. And so they have Fauci come out with a lab coat, and it's like, it's very, oh, it's the priest said so, but now in our nation state, kind of social model, that is the new religion, and you're right. I mean, that is very canny that you notice that regarding Darwin, and kind of, how that quote that you had in the presentation, how if you attack something directly, if you would attack the Bible at that time period directly, it would have triggered an immunological response and people would have gotten defensive. But if you do it subtly around the edges, you just knock out the deluge theory, you knock out this biblical, precept, or this biblical, just, and then you subtly do it, and the people do, it's like a boiling frog. So
Yeah, yeah, they noticed that Darwin's method of using so-called science worked, and so they've been emulating that. It's stuck with a winner, I guess you might say. And speaking of uniforms, James Corbett, there was an interesting clip in one of his videos
mhm.
where this guy dressed up in a security or police-like uniform was telling people, "Step over here, file through this exit here."
Mhm.
Entrance here, um, and everybody would obey. But when he didn't have the uniform, he just dressed in street clothes, nobody paid attention to him because that
Interesting.
symbol of authority was gone.
Yeah, there was a woman who, and take this is a huge grain of salt, but she claimed to be a daughter of like a, powerful, connected Illuminati family. This was back in the 90s. And she said that they were going to plan, kind of synthetic terrorism and acts to destabilize the society. And she
Mm-hmm.
said they would make it so bad that, they would just release the nihilists and atheists, and they would destroy everything. Crime would be running rampant, and then people would be craving for order. And then she said, at that point, when you're craving for law and order, because we've basically let all the criminals out, nobody's being prosecuted, everybody's suffering, we
Mm-hmm.
will have men show up in black SUVs in military looking uniforms, and those men will restore order, and those will be our people. And it was just chilling, just the way she said it, kind of like matter of factly, like I wonder what happened to those. I wonder they've probably long since been taken down, but yeah, just very chilling. And it's sad how human psychology works. And that was another social science experiment as well. Zimbardo did that one with the uniforms. They put a uniform on people, and it would totally change their behavior. It was the Stanford Prison experiments. Yeah, our leaders have studied this stuff, and I hate the fact that our side has not. Like, our side is kind of like herding cats, and they're just like everywhere, going off and all. Meanwhile, the other side is just methodically funding. It's like, why is nobody methodically funding freedom? Or freedom movement, or whatever, like keeping our rights and our culture. No, nobody's funding that. They're just funding, how do you, manipulate people with costumes and masks.
And one thing they have going in their favor is they have technology that's well ahead of ours, and they also have money, trillions of dollars to spend on convincing people and developing technologies, and so they're not going to develop a technology that will advocate truth. So they leave it to us people with very limited bank accounts to try to get our message across. And we try to appeal to people on the basis of truth, because we don't have, the $1 billion funding that they have for, mass publication. We don't, you and I don't sit in CNN type studios where you have, all these screens behind us and co-anchors, things like that, which money will buy. So they have a lot going in their favor, but again, they don't have the truth on their side. And so we have the advantage of being able to appeal to people through logic, for those who can be reached with it, about what the truth really is. They don't. They have to, do a fancy dance to try to explain away the contradictions in the narratives that they're giving us.
Well, I'm going to give you a white pill, because I was talking to an investment banker, and I will not share his name, but I assure you he is an investment banker, and he's their sustainability guy. So he's a man to the left, and he was complaining to me. He was like, these people are having an effect, and they're basically ruining ESG, the environmental social governance protocols that they were trying to like foist on society. And he said, because of technology, he was like, these people, they have reach that they shouldn't have. He was complaining, so he was talking about people like you, James Perloff, that you think you're not actually making a dent, but you are, because the people behind the scenes on the other side, they're like, we're spending trillions of dollars on this lie, and this one idiot comes along and puts some truth out for free. And it actually, it's flipping mayors, it's flipping aldermen, it's flipping, legislators, so it was just funny getting that from the other side and hearing that, the James Perloffs are effective. So I'm gonna end that there, actually, but I'm gonna give you the last word, James, and I'm gonna go ahead. What are your last thoughts on this this little session here?
You mean for the whole program?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so are we gonna be ending off soon? I'm sorry.
Okay. Wrap it up here.
Well, we have been seeing the unfolding of the New World Order for many years now, and for people like myself, it's like peeling layers of an onion off. You keep discovering new things about it you didn't know before. I had a rudimentary knowledge of the New World Order in 1978 when I read Gary Allen's book, Non-Derrick Conspiracy, but it never changed my mind about the fact that there is an oligarchy controlling the world, and you learn more and more things as you go on. And we're actually entering a very dangerous phase right now. We see Albert Pike, of course, the Satanist Freemason leader of America back in the 19th century, predicted there would be three world wars to usher in the age of the Antichrist, and the Third World War being the one that in effect brought that about. And as we see ships of different nations gathering in the Mediterranean in response to this Gaza bombing, as we see alliances hardening, we see a very dangerous situation out there where the Third World War might be upon us. I don't know how they would carry that out, because an all-out nuclear world war would certainly destroy many of the things that they've been working to implement, like climate change lockdowns and digital ID. You can't really destroy the whole world if you're going to. What about this 5G infrastructure that'll be taken down by a nuclear war? I don't know what they're planning. Maybe they want a nuclear limited exchange so that people will be scared just enough to accept a world government. I don't know what they have in their minds, but I do feel we're living in very perilous times. The immigration crisis. A lot of people think that these immigrants have been given free cell phones, or a lot of these young men are just waiting for a signal to attack here in America and Europe. So it's a dangerous time. It's a fulfillment of not only what we've been saying, but more significantly what the Bible says. The Bible says that no one could buy or sell without the mark of the beast. I was immediately alarmed during when I said people couldn't buy or sell without a mask. And then in my city of Boston, the mayor made a rule you couldn't buy or sell. You couldn't go to a restaurant or other major public venue without proof of vaccination. Now they relaxed that. It's not highly topical right now, but they might start another pandemic. But we see biblical prophecies being fulfilled. And in my that PowerPoint I mentioned that gave on the New World Order, that 2-hour talk I mentioned, there's a clip of a woman at Whole Foods who actually makes a purchase with a microchip in her hand. Now, the Bible says in the book of Revelation that the mark of the beast will be on your hand or your forehead. I'm saying, we're very close. We're very close technologically to what the Bible predicted. I mean, they've got Bill Gates funded Rice School of Engineering, Bioengineering, developing a digital tattoo that'll have your financial and vaccine records in it. And there's a company in Sweden that's developed a microchip. The company's called Disruptive Subdermals, and they've developed a microchip that gives a PDF readout of your vaccination record. We're getting awfully close to fulfillment of what the Bible talks about. And there were years ago I used to hear people talk about this is the age of the Antichrist, and there was a theory that Ronald Reagan was the Antichrist because his name was Ronald Wilson Reagan. 666. Each name had 6 letters, so Ronald Reagan was 666. He's the Antichrist. I had a lot of ridiculous theories, but right now I have to say quite honestly that we see the technology reaching a point, and the consolidation of control, which is very important. For the I always like to say, for the Antichrist to govern the world, he needs a world government. And so it's not something where he's going to snap his fingers and create a world government. It's being developed incrementally ever since the League of Nations was established in 1919. So we're seeing end times fulfilled or beginning to be fulfilled within our time. And so this is not only a time for people to have a political awakening, but a spiritual awakening, because actually we talk about geopolitical warfare. We're talking about ultimately what is spiritual warfare taking place, when we see Darwin advancing science with a secret motive to destroy people's faith in the Bible. You can see that this is the forces of Satan against God taking place over a long period of time. So I hope that more people will awaken to the geopolitics, to the need to sustain our freedom, but also to recognize that we're seeing the Bible fulfilled, and that we need to make sure that we are on a good footing with God, because the reign of the Antichrist, according to the Bible, will only last 3.5 years. 1,260 days is one way they put it. So I regard the New World Order as a finite thing, where God emerges victorious in the end. So we want to be on the right side of history, long-term history, be on God's side, as well as understanding the politics that are underlying the situation.
Okay, well, very well said, James. So how can people find your work? You mentioned jamesperloff.net before. Are there any other? And I mentioned Twitter, that you're a great
but Twitter account. I'm heavily shadow banned on Twitter, so I've begun posting on Gab. And I started a Rumble account because I had these 2 videos, one on Creation Evolution, one on the New World Order, that I wanted to upload on my own. But people go to my website, they can scroll down and go through the blog and find posts that interested them. I covered a lot of things in there, from history, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. These are my books. We mentioned, The Shadow of the Powers, the history of the Council on Foreign Relations, published in 1988 when Reagan was president. But I also have Truth as a Lonely Warrior, which is really a primer on the New World Order, and that was supplemented. That was written in 2013. 2019, I wrote 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw, which fills in some things I didn't cover in enough detail in the first book, or things I didn't even mention, like 5G and electromagnetic frequencies. Talk a little bit too about some of the Freemasonic beginnings of America, other things that the first book didn't cover. Also a book out which Amazon censored, even though it was their number one bestseller in respiratory diseases. They censored it, and they wouldn't tell me why.
Let's have you on. I want to talk to you next time if you would, because that interests me, the Freemasonic angle of the founding of the United States. I was just talking about that, like the British East India Company, and how they, everywhere they went, they would have Freemasonic lodges. They would put these lodges as little embassies everywhere. And how the Mayflower was owned by the British East India Company, and how all these founding fathers and the financiers of the revolution and stuff had ties to the British East India Company, which was Freemasonic lodges. George Washington, Aaron Burr, there's a whole list of kind of the founders. So yeah, I'm going to hit that subject with you, but we can't this time. So let's wrap this up. And I thank you, James, for coming on. You're the best, man. I'd like to take a moment to thank you for watching. If you'd like to stay updated, hit the like and subscribe buttons. But more importantly, if you don't want to see me reduced to shilling my old merch, such as the Daniel Natal in action figure, where you can see Daniel engaging in an action as he watches TV, or engaging in an action as he surfs the internet, or failed products like the Daniel Natal Pez dispenser, or the even more ill-considered Daniel Natal urinal cake, think about supporting the show by buying one of my books. For instance, you can buy my book, Actionable Ethics. The link is in the description below.